Well, as you know, a lot of people write me and send me information. And I read this little ditty and couldn't help but make a video on it. I'm going to read it to you. And I ask that you keep an open mind. It's very interesting. And the end of this 30-page document is, well, it's cause for concern because the predictions this man makes are spot on. And when we reflect back on recent history, we see that Lindsey Graham in 2013 said the homeland is a battlefield. And of course, you had Justice Scalia in 2014 or 15, right before his untimely demise, mentioned that very soon the United States citizens will be gathered up and taken to FEMA camps, which is a polite way of saying concentration camps. So, in reading this, just keep an open mind and understand that I have no way of verifying this information. However, dare I say, the future proves the past, and what we've seen in the last 2 to 3 years, this 30-page document really will open your eyes. It's called The Matrix, the U.S. Constitution, by no name, hidden for his safety. Introduction. During my 12 years as a judge, I always insisted on truth and placed justice above law and order. I could have prepared this article indica of a research paper. However, people tend to lose interest when articles of this nature become too technical. Science has taught us that much. For every action, there is a positive reaction. If your life on Earth resembles a matrix, it is because you are seeing things for the first time, with eyes wide open, but you feel confused. That feeling of confusion is appropriate because the information you are now digesting contradicts much of the information you have been spoon-fed throughout your life. I named this paper after the movie The Matrix, written by Wachowski brothers. After reading this, watch the movie and you will notice many similarities. In 2002, my brother ran into a problem with the IRS, and to help him out, I began to research the tax code. One thing led to another, and suddenly I was uncovering information about our government, which was directly in conflict with the U.S. Constitution and what I have been led to believe throughout my life. In time, I began to interface with people from every state in the Republic who was doing the same thing I was doing. Some for the same reasons and others for different reasons. We began to trade our research, and the facts I uncovered was totally in contradiction to the history of America, which had been taught to us in public schools and the principles of law. I had absorbed during my service as a judge. I began to assist people to prepare and file suit in the courts, and filed several of my own. At one point, because of the information I'm about to provide to you, I became extremely depressed. After about 3 months, I eventually shook it off and continued on with my research. My hope in writing this is to help you, the reader, make sense of it all, which will require you to wash your mind clean of the brainwashing you were subject to by our government. Our government controlled public schools and churches, and re-educate yourself. When you understand the actions, the reactions will make sense, and it should anger you. Eventually, you will have a choice to make, a choice that will define how to survive life in the Matrix. In the Matrix, nothing is real. However, your mind has been conditioned to believe it is real. The Matrix is far too big to defeat. No one can escape it, and we haven't the means or intelligence to beat those in control. Through my research, I discovered that America is a society of functional illiterates. I remind you that this is not my opinion. I am just the messenger. The people in charge of the Matrix represent the powerful and intelligent humans on Earth. When gifted children appear in public schools of the world, they are courted with scholarships, money, and eventually memberships into secret societies. They will be introduced to very persuasive intellectuals who will convince these young gifted people that it is their place and duty to be a part of the elite who rule the world populations. Because the rest of the world populations are too stupid to make decisions for themselves. Their comment, not mine. When the New World Order is officially and openly in control, only the extremely intelligent will be allowed to propagate. Everyone else will be sterilized or murdered through staged pandemics used to eliminate excessive populations. Every foreign revolution, the world wars, the Depression, Prohibition, Korea, Vietnam, and Middle East conflicts, and the influenza epidemic during World War I was planned and orchestrated by these people. Many early writers researched much of this history and were forced to fund their own publications and the distribution of their work. Most never received the acclaim they deserve and never knew our government was responsible for their failures. I am prepared to supply anyone interested with mounds of research in support of what I have written here. When I've conveyed parts of this information in court documents, the opposition lawyers respond to their client that I'm just crazy, and if the judge is within earshot of that comment, he will nod his head in judicial agreement. Well, I guess that caps it. If a lawyer and a lawyer judge both contend that I'm crazy, then I must be crazy. They wouldn't lie to you, or would they? The motive of our founding fathers was totally self-centered. It was their personal greed that inspired them to accept the task of writing the Constitution of the United States and not patriotism. In actuality, the United States is not a land or a place. It's a corporation, a legal fiction that existed well before the Revolutionary War. See Republica versus Sweeney, 1 Dallas, 43 and 28 USC 3002-15. The Constitution of the United States was written in secret by the Founding Fathers and was never presented to the colonists for a vote. Surely any document as important as this demanded the approval of the people it governed. Well, it wasn't presented for a vote because the Constitution wasn't created for we the people. It was created by and for the Founding Fathers, their families, heirs, and their posterity. The Constitution is a business plan, and any reference contained within it that appears to be a safeguard of a right is there because none of the Founding Fathers trusted each other. The safeguards were intended to prevent any one of the group of them from cutting out the others, proving that there is no honor amongst thieves. Americans are not unlike all other human who inhabit the earth. All human beings possess malleable minds, which are minds that can be sharpened and controlled. And when government shapes and controls the mind, it's called brainwashing. Brainwashing causes the subject to become functionally illiterate. In America, our foundational ignorance excels in the areas of history, government, and law, which really are one and the same. 98% of the officials in public office are lawyers, and these so-called representatives set policies and create the law that govern this society. Their use of Greek and Latin terms in law and the habit of changing definitions and usage of common words is international. The intent is to confound and confuse the general public and to hide the treason they are implementing, and so that members of the public are forced or decide to hire a lawyer out of the confusion rather than to try to represent themselves in our fictional courts of law. As you read on, I'll explain to you why and how our courts and law are fictional. There has been a law on the books created by the Congress which made it illegal for a common man to practice law. Every judge of a district, circuit, or appeal court, except justices and magistrates, is a lawyer and a member of the bar. These judges have the authority to establish local rules of the court, and those mentioned have created a local rule that prevents common people from representing any other person in their court or to practice law without a license. A license requires that you produce your bar association number. For those who don't know, the bar association is simply a lawyers' union, and when lawyers are accepted into the bar, they are required to swear allegiance to a foreign power. The American Bar Association is a branch of a national organization titled the National Lawyers Guild Communist Party and can be found recorded in the United States Code at Title 28 USC 3002 Section 15A. They have become so big and entrenched that they no longer fear reprisal. Whenever I tell people that there is no actual law that makes it a crime to represent another person in the court, their reaction is liar. I remind them that Abraham Lincoln and Clarence Darrow never went to law school or passed the bar. But their reaction is understandable because the bar is a very powerful organization and its members have infiltrated every inch of American life and business. How many times in your life have you heard you can't practice law without a license? I've heard it said in numerous movies spanning 100 years, in my mother's soaps and by comedians in jokes, and in the theatrical skits. I've seen the phrase in print in newspaper articles, magazines, and heard it on the radio. Before I learned the truth about this fact, even my personal lawyer made that comment to me. We all have been brainwashed to believe a lie because we have heard it so often from people we trust and who are supposed to have our best interest at heart. We all just assume it must be true. How many other lies have you assumed it must be true? Our American society has been lied to by their government and lawyers more times than you will sign your name in your lifetime. And we have been indoctrinated, brainwashed to believe that the Constitution was created for we the people. The purpose behind these lies is to make you believe that you are free, safe, protected, and secure. And it is all an hallucination. How many of you have studied each line of the Constitution, the statutes at large, and the Articles of Confederation, armed with the reputable dictionary of law or a law dictionary from that era? If you take the time to do so, you will soon discover that the true purpose of the Constitution was to create a business plan and to establish a military government for the protection of the Founding Fathers, the King's commerce, protection of his agents, and the future control of his subject slaves. Even the preamble of the U.S. Constitution is a clue to the lie, and which states, to ourselves and our posterity. If you never saw the title, the Constitution, and you were never told what this document was about, what do you think would be your first impression upon hearing or reading it? To ourselves and our posterity. The Constitution is not for we the people, and America is a matrix of misinformation. In the eyes of those in control, America is nothing more than a large plantation, and we the people are the slaves. In many U.S. and world treaties, the term high contracting power is used to define your masters. Everyone else is considered by them to be their slaves. All of the Founding Fathers had two things in common. They all shared the gift of a good education or were gifted individuals. And they all came from families of business or substance. These men all suffered from visions of grandeur. They viewed America as their one opportunity to make them powerful and wealthy, to ourselves and our posterity. Initially, their plan was to steal America away from the king, despite the fact that King George funded the exploration of the New World, which legally gave him first claim to all new continents discovered. The seizure of the Americas by the king's explorers was not as it has been depicted in our history books. Presented to us by our government in our government-controlled public schools, Native Americans, the Indians, were murdered, their villages burned. Many were enslaved, infected by diseases brought from England, and their lands taken by force and the threat of force by these early explorers. The Indians were labeled savages by those immigrant explorers from England, but the true savages were our English ancestors. One thing the founding fathers did not know was that all of the king's land and all future acquisitions, such as the Americas, had been given and pledged by King John to the Pope Innocent III and the Holy Roman Church by the Treaty of 1213. After that fact was proven to the founding fathers, King George and representatives from the Vatican decided to use the constitutional draft created by the founding fathers to further their plan to control the colonist. Control attained by bringing the colonist to their knees in debt. Any way you read it, the Constitution was never written with the intent of benefiting the American people. Did you know that 98% of law schools in America and England do not include constitutional law as part of their law curriculum? The reason for this phenomenon is because constitutional law does not apply to or affect the enforcement of statutes, codes, or administrative regulations which have replaced constitutional law. The common law, public law, and penal law, and which have been designed to control you, ergo, constitutional law is taught as an elective at Harvard, Yale, and Cambridge, and only for students of law who are planning a future career in government. This should make sense to you as you read on. In the true history of America, neither side won the Revolutionary War. At first, the appearance of English troops in the colonies was simply a show of force by King George intended to intimidate the colonists and force them to pay him taxes. Factually, back in England, English soldiers refused to take up arms against the colonists because they were English citizens and relatives. Mr. Mayor Amschel Burer founded the Rothschild banking empire. By this time, owned the king. Mr. Burer had extended unlimited credit to the king and arranged contracts with him, which permitted the Rothschild tax collector to represent and collect the king's tax from the king's subjects. This is the origin of the concept behind the establishment of the IRS. It was Burer who suggested to King George that he enforce a tax against the colonists in the New World, since the tax being collected in England was barely enough to pay the interest of the king's loan. When English soldiers refused to fight, Mr. Burer negotiated a contract with unemployed Russian Germanic soldiers to fight for King George at a cost of 50 cents a day. Burer, when informed King George that he had hired these soldiers in the king's name, but at a cost of $1 a day. King George utilized these soldiers, dressed them in English soldier uniforms, and ordered his career officers to command them. When his show of force in the colony failed, Mr. Burer suggested that King George finance the colonists in their war effort against him and bring the colonists to their knees in debt. The king succeeded in accomplishing this through his appointed civilian figureheads in charge of his government of France. Mr. Burer wanted to expand his banking empire into the colonies. He discovered that the colonists didn't trade in gold or silver, but used script as a basis of their economy. The script money used were promissory notes printed by the colonists. All the colonists agreed that they would consider these notes the lawful currency of the colonies. Mr. Burer wanted gold or silver and induced the king to demand that his tax in the colonies be paid in gold or silver. It was that condition that broke the camel's back and caused the Boston Tea Party. However, whoever controls the money controls the country. Rothschild. Superstitiously, King George infiltrated the colonies and their futile attempt to form a new government using spies composed of English lawyers and English aristocrats loyal to him. The spies' assignment was to infiltrate the new government, carry out the plan to defeat the colonists through debt, and establish regular reports to the king. The church also had their appointed representatives in place to protect and ensure that their interest is being observed. Much of the loans received from the French went into the pockets of the founding fathers. The founding fathers eventually conceded to King George and the Holy Roman Church's demands. By and through the intervention and persuasiveness of the king's spies, ironically, the common denominator or glue that eventually bound King George, the founding fathers, the English lawyers, and English aristocrats together was a secret society called the Illuminati. Even Paul Revere and Benjamin Franklin were members of the Illuminati. This secret society had a criminal and deadly past in Europe, and in America they were eventually renamed the Free and Accepted Masons. The majority of the regular membership of the Free and Accepted Masons do not know about the Illuminati influence within their ranks and file. The Illuminati members operate out of a special secret society separate from the regular Masonic membership and are found in every branch of the Free and Accepted Masons of the world. Think about the colonists who we have been taught to revere by our public school system. All of these individuals were members of this secret society and all were traitors. Our history books also instruct us to apathize the founding fathers, but don't hold them in reverence, hold them in contempt by and through their intervention. Slaves you are, and slaves you will forever be. An example of a man in history we have been taught to revere is Benjamin Franklin. Would it shock you to learn that he was on the king's payroll and his many trips to England was actually to report on the colonial government to the king? The Declaration of Independence is another story omitted from our American history books. Of the 51 men involved in the creation of the Declaration of Independence, 21 were actually traitors, and one of the king's on the king's payroll. During the Revolutionary War, English officers were provided the names and addresses and family members of these 30 loyalists involved in the creation and signing of the Declaration of Independence. The English soldiers had been ordered to hunt down and murder all 30 loyalists, their wives, children, and all relatives. With further instructions to burn their bodies inside their homes, the soldiers were to leave no trace of these men and their families, to wipe out their existence for an eternity. The history of civilization has taught us all that martyrs are dangerous to men of power, and King George didn't want to leave any martyrs. It is pretty obvious who provided the detailed information about the 30 loyalists, their family, and their addresses. At first glance, it appears that Guy Madison of Virginia was so concerned about lawyers holding any position in American government that he championed the 13th Amendment, which barred lawyers from holding any public office in government. The 13th Amendment was ratified but never made it into print in our government-controlled school books and public classrooms. The amendment was surreptitiously removed and replaced by the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment became the 14th Amendment, and so on. Madison's efforts appear admirable, but his later actions as a member of the First Congress suggest that his only real concern was to block lawyers from undermining and the theft that he and his compatriots had planned for America. Once the cost of the Revolutionary War sufficiently placed the colonists in debt, the English soldiers were ordered to dispense with their efforts, recover their arms, and within the next 8 years, they eventually returned to England. The colonists were so glad to see the fighting stop that they allowed the soldiers to retreat and exit America peacefully. There is an old legal maxim that states, "The first to leave the field of battle loses." Pursuant to this maximum, the Founding Fathers proclaimed the colonists the victors. A maxim is a legal truth that is time-honored and incorruptible. In reality, the war was just a diversion. The colonists had no chance of succeeding in their efforts. Examine the facts for yourself. During this era, England had the largest army and navy in the world. King George owned England, Ireland, and France, having a combined population of about 60 million subjects. The colonists were poorly educated, poorly armed, and composed of farmers, tradesmen, bond slaves, women, and children, and boasted a total population of only 3 million subjects. And considering the undermining that was occurring to their nation by the king's spies and the founding fathers, the colonists didn't have a prayer of defeating the English. Americans have been indoctrinated by our federal and state governments and through governmental controlled public schools and literature, government controlled media, and government controlled churches. Yes, even the churches, to believe that America defeated the English. We celebrate the victory of and our so-called independence each year on the 4th of July, and it is all a bunch of propaganda, a carrot to lead the horse and keep this society stupid and passive. We boast today that our country represents the finest schools in the world, but in reality, we are no smarter than the first colonist. We only know more about other things because of new technology developments during the last 250 years, and yet the average IQ of the America is 70. Documented proof that the Constitution was not for us and can be found at Paddleford, Fay, and Co. versus the mayor and alderman of the city of Savannah, Georgia, 14 Georgia 438 520. This was a court case wherein the plaintiffs sued the city of Savannah for violating what they believed were their constitutionally protected rights. The decision of the judge says it all. But indeed, no private person has a right to complain by suit in court on the ground of a breach of the Constitution. The Constitution, it is true, is a compact, but he, the private person, is not party to it. Emphasis added. The United States Constitution was converted into a trust, and the legal definition of a trust is a legal obligation with respect to property given by one person, donor, to another, trustee, to the advantage of a beneficiary, Americans. The property in this trust includes all land, your personal possessions that you believe you own, and your physical body. The donor of the trust is the King of England and the Holy Roman Church. The trustees are all federal and state public officials, which means that they truly are agents of a foreign power, the King and the Vatican. The reason the Constitution was converted into a trust is because as a non-trust business plan, the Constitution completely bound the hands of our government officials. By their converting it into a trust, our public officials were then free to make any changes they desired to this government without their constituents' knowledge. The rules of a trust are secret, and no trustee can be compelled to divulge those rules, and the rules can be changed by the trustee without notice to the beneficiary. The one pitfall confronting them and their plan was the fact that by converting the Constitution into a trust, our public officials had to legally assign a beneficiary, and the beneficiaries chosen could not offend or be in contrast to the numerous international treaties that were in force. Our public officials wanted to stay in control of the trust as the trustees. However, a trustee cannot also be a beneficiary. So even though the Constitution was never designed or written for a sovereign American people, they unknowingly became the beneficiary of this secret trust, and hence the creation of the propaganda regarding our constitutional rights. All high-ranking public officials, lawyers, and judges laugh at the ignorance of the people who claim that their constitutional rights have been violated. Lawyers are actually taught to treat the members of the general public as inferior individuals. This also explains the air of arrogance that most lawyers convey in their demeanor and speech. The more powerful agents of the states and the federal government, however, have been stealing the benefits from the trust through numerous maneuvers that have the appearance of being lawful. In their defense, many former public officials, agents, were not corrupt to begin with, but by accepting bribes or as the result of enjoying an arranged extramarital relationship, they became the victim of an extortion plot and succumbed to the threat to expose the bribe or their illicit affairs to their constituents. By becoming an agent, all was forgiven and forgotten. The people who arranged the bribes also arranged the situations and applied the pressure to force honest men to become dishonest. An example of this could be a sudden demand by a bank to pay off a loan based upon a hidden clause in the loan contract, and which could result in a foreclosure, bankruptcy, and scandal. There are no remaining public federal employees in America. All employees who you believe to be a part of America's government are actually agents of a foreign government, and this definition includes the president. The federal elections are a joke on us. All of the candidates have been jointly pre-selected and pre-screened by the National Board of the Republican and Democrat parties well before the election process. All of our federally elected officials, appointed administrators, federal police, and judges receive their paychecks through the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, is a division of the International Monetary Fund, which is owned by the Rockefeller and Rothschild families and their banking empires, which operate in tandem with the United Nations. The IRS and Interpol are owned by the International Monetary Fund, which has been identified in an earlier version of the U.S. Army Manual as a communist organization. Those Americans who do not know how to assert their beneficiary status are treated by the government and their courts as a corporate fiction. The corporate government and their courts only have jurisdiction over a corporation. Corporations have no rights or jurisdiction over living people and are only provided consideration which have been pre-negotiated in contracts by their directors. Otherwise, they are governed totally by commercial law, and so are you. At this point, I believe I should address a corporate fiction for you by creating a situation you can relate to. Situation. You've decided to go into business for yourself, and you thought up a clever name for your business. Everything you have read and the advice received from a lawyer or friend suggested that you should incorporate your business. To incorporate is to create a business on paper. It isn't real. It is a business in theory, which makes it a fiction. The lawyer or accountant you hired to prepare your corporation records your business with the state as a state corporation and identifies you as a president of a board of directors, not the owner. Your business is now a corporate fiction, and by recording the business as a state corporation, you no longer own it. The state owns it. You just gave your business away and made yourself an employee. Our presumed government representatives have done the same thing to each of us. They changed each of us from a sovereign into a corporate fiction. Your corporate name is easily identifiable in that it is expressed in all capital letters on all your documents and all communications received from every government agency. The reason for converting every sovereign American into a corporate fiction dates back to the principle of law under the king. The king is a sovereign monarch and dictator who by his authority creates the law that governs his subjects. He is the source of law, and therefore the law cannot be enforced against him. In America, the source of law is the sovereign people, and therefore no law can be enforced against the source except for those specifically agreed to or defined by the original Constitution. Those laws are defined as theft, assault, and criminal mischief, but since the colonists never voted on the Constitution, none of these offenses are enforceable against a living sovereign. They are enforceable, however, against a corporate or corporate fiction. In theory, and according to the common law, before any sovereign can be arrested for one of these crimes, a complaint must be filed with the elected sheriff. The sheriff, by his own authority, assembles a common law jury of the accused sovereign's immediate neighbors, called a grand jury. The neighbors hear the complaint and evidence presented to them by the complainant. They are permitted to ask questions of any witness and can subpoena anyone else who can shed light on the allegations. A majority must then decide if the accused sovereign is to be tried by a court. All of this is done without a judge or prosecutor in attendance. This is a real grand jury proceeding, which is far removed from the joke perpetrated by our corporate government and courts today. What happened to our grand jury rights of old? The Bar Association has successfully stolen that right away from the sovereign people, little by little through rewrites of the Judiciary Act, so that now the American public believes that the grand jury is an instrument subject to the jurisdiction, right, and whim of the prosecuting attorney. The prosecuting attorney controls the entire proceeding, and who testifies. The judge then tells the jury what the law is, and the members of the panel are always denied the opportunity to view the written law. All of our governments are corporations and are responsible for the creation of about 800,000 laws called statutes, which are designed to control the sovereign people of America. Just like the king, these statutes cannot be enforced against the source of law, which are the living, breathing flesh and blood sovereign people. All of the agents in power, beginning with the king, the Vatican, and the founding fathers, and now our presumed public officials, wanted to obtain power and control over America, and the Constitution pretty much prohibited them from achieving those ends. So they began and devised ways to change the sovereign Americans into a corporate fiction. These agents also decided and reasoned that they cannot educate the masses without exposing their treachery, and so our private and public education must be controlled. Without any real constitutional basis, the U.S. Department of Education was created. The Constitution made it the responsibility of each state to educate their people, and several states challenged the Congress in the courts. The matter was eventually heard by the U.S. Supreme Court, which has never been a constitutional Article III court for its inspection, which I will explain. The Supreme Court ruled that the federal government was entitled to oversee the educational requirements of United States citizens by virtue of their constitutional power to regulate commerce. Bad law is bad law, no matter how you turn the paper, and that ruling gave the federal government the green light to initiate its brainwashing process of the American public. Let me explain how the court arrived at its ruling, because these are not ignorant men. On every form you file to receive government benefits, and even the voter's registration form, there is a question that asks, are you a United States citizen, yes or no? And everyone circles the answer, yes. Didn't you? Now look up the definition of United States citizen in a reputable law dictionary. You will discover the United States citizen is a phrase designed to identify a corporate fiction. Clever, isn't it? You and every other American had no idea that you were admitting you were a corporate fiction when you circled the that yes answer, and you did it under penalty of perjury. The sovereign states had been abolished in 1790 by the adoption of Article 1 of the Statutes at Large, which converted all the sovereign states into federal districts and gave the federal government lawful jurisdiction everywhere. In consideration of the fact that the federal government is a corporation and that the corporations can lawfully own other corporations, and all the American subjects to be educated have admitted under penalty of perjury that they are corporations, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the corporate federal government. See how sneaky and tricky lawyers can be? And all the more reason why lawyers should never be allowed to serve in government or in judgment of us. Under our corporate governments, no sovereign can lawfully be tried or convicted of any statutory crime. I recently discovered how to avoid prosecution under the trust when a sovereign is taken before a corporate prosecuting attorney or a judge. First, the sovereign must inquire if we are on the record, and if not, insist upon it. Say nothing, sign nothing, and answer no questions until you are convinced that the proceedings are being recorded. Secondly, all a sovereign has to say for the record is, I am a beneficiary of the trust and I am appointing you as my trustee. Thirdly, the sovereign then directs his trustee to do his bidding. As my trustee, I want you to discharge this matter I am accused of and eliminate the record. Fourthly, if the sovereign suffered any damages as a result of his arrest, he can direct that the trust compensate him for the proceeds of the court by saying, I wish to be compensated for X amount of dollars in redemption. This statement is sufficient to remove the authority and jurisdiction from any prosecuting attorney or judge. The accused will be immediately released from custody with a check, license, or claim he identifies as a damage. It doesn't matter what the action involves or how it is classified by the corporate law as a civil or criminal action. It works every time. All of the codes, statutes, and regulations throughout the United States are a will from the masters to their slaves. A will is defined an express command used in a dispositive nature. When individuals in America are charged with a crime and warehoused in a jail, it is because they went against the will of the master and not because they harmed another person. Remember that. The will demands from us all that we are, keeps us in check, and promises us nothing. When we return, we'll be talking about the police officers.